So, I hear Final Fantasy XIV is a big deal now or something. Hey, I play this game a lot. I know how it works inside and out. I should be getting in on this. So hey, I'm Alex, and I run the channel First 5, where I'm always asking if games are worth your time, not your money. I normally cover much shorter games that you can ideally enjoy over just a few play sessions because I am a chronically busy person who does not have the time for massive time-sucking games like MMOs. But I am, perhaps paradoxically, a massive fan of one MMO and one MMO only that I have been playing on and off for 6 years now. And I'm here to talk about how Final Fantasy XIV is the most streamlined MMO I have ever enjoyed at every single level of play that is highly respectful of your time, whether you are just starting out at level 1 or are engaging in hardcore endgame raiding. So often, genres like the MMO can feel like such horrendous time sinks as to be entirely impossible to enjoy if you're a busy adult with an actual life outside of playing video games. But as a fellow busy adult with a job, familial responsibilities, and multiple hobbies, I'm here to say that FF14 breaks the mold of what you'd normally expect from any other MMO, and can absolutely be enjoyed, even on a busy schedule. This isn't so much a video debating whether critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV with its free trial up to level 60, including the award-winning expansion Heavensward, is good or not. It is! Go play it! But what I am here to talk about is how Final Fantasy XIV is fundamentally different from every other MMO I have ever played on a structural level, and how those structural differences make this game wildly more accessible than its peers for anybody who wants to have 2 hobbies. Not all of these innovations are entirely unique to FF14 specifically, and other MMOs have started drifting in this direction, but it is only here where you'll find them all in aggregate, and it all stems from a fundamental difference in design priorities.
なぜなら今、本当にみんな忙しい。一つのゲームだけに、なんだろう、毎日ログインし続けられるわけじゃない。それはもともと MMO が大好きな僕ですらそうなので。
Unlike almost any other game in its field, FF14 is not designed to be the only game you are playing. It is designed to be picked up, played through, and then when you've finished all its content, set down again. And that is actually pretty much singular in this genre. And this isn't even just comparing FF14 to other traditional MMOs like World of Warcraft. You would think that something like, say, Destiny might be a positively breezy game compared to a stuffy old traditional MMO, but games as service titles are designed with the express intent of consuming as much of your time as possible. Time is money, friend, and games like Destiny and The Division want the biggest slice of the market share they can possibly get, which leads to a lot of incredibly hostile design like grinding systems that want you to log on every single night, and content that gets vaulted if you don't get to it fast enough. And for someone like me who doesn't have the time or convenience to schedule their entire life around a video game, that's a hard pass from me, Chief. But even with all that said, Final Fantasy XIV as it currently exists is probably a pretty intimidating wall of content to tackle. If you played it like me and have been enjoying it as it was released since the start, then you got to enjoy this game at a much more reasonably consumable pace, just investing 30 hours every year or two. But if you're only just thinking about jumping on board now and need to play through the past almost decade of content, including 3 different expansions and all the connective patch content in between them, well, you're looking at a pretty hefty time investment to get through the whole thing. You're not playing one game. You're playing 4. You're basically doing the MMO equivalent of binging the Yakuza series. But as we're going to get into, even if the game asks for a fairly substantial amount of your time, it's immensely respectful about what it does with it. And I meant it when I said that respect starts right from level 1. So let's talk about the beginner's experience.
To all of my children in whom life flows abundant.
If there's one word I can use to describe A Realm Reborn these days, it's economical, and that's best illustrated by what will be your literal first steps in this game. Before we can even get into talking about Final Fantasy XIV's base game, I want to talk about what will effectively be your first 5 hours in the game, which will take you all the way up to around like level 20 to 25 or so. You get a complete, compact single narrative arc with a beginning, middle, and end that'll run you about 3 hours start to finish before giving you a satisfying conclusion. After that, it's an hour getting introduced to all the major narrative elements in the game going forward, and then you get 3 back-to-back dungeons to give you a taste of how the actual MMO half of the game works. Unlike a lot of MMOs that like to undergo a radical shift once you hit max level, this game knows exactly what it's about, and it's polite enough to let you know up front. But more importantly, you can actually have a pretty fun opening few hours, which might not be completely unique among MMOs, but is honestly a little bit rare. These games tend to be slow cookers that have trained their audiences to have a fair bit of patience with them, but FF14's gone and completely upended that idea with these tightly constructed opening hours. But it all does depend on a few key choices at the start of the game. The two big decisions you'll have to make up front are what class you want to play and what city you want to start in. Unfortunately, these two decisions are connected. Let's start with classes, and yes, we are actually going to pause for a second to go on a tangent about this. There are a ton of videos out there that could explain every class in this game better than I could, but most of them are talking about how those classes work at level 80. And one place where I'll admit FF14 falters is that some of its classes get stuck hitting one button ad nauseum for the first 30 levels. And that's really fucking boring. So let's avoid that. Instead, I've found that if you want to start off right, the Arcanist, Thaumaturge, and Pugilist classes have some of the most entertaining gameplay during those early levels. Without getting too into the weeds about it, Arcanist gets a whole-ass honest-to-god 30-second rotation as early as level 15, and Pugilist gets something similar with 5 upfront abilities that all combo in and out of each other to create unique effects like buffs and dots that you need to juggle. Thaumaturge is a little weirder to explain, but the class has a very bizarre and unique progression compared to its peers, where the introduction of new abilities just completely upends how your entire class works on the regular. Having to completely relearn your entire rotation every 10 levels might be a little irritating, but you certainly won't be bored. But complicating your decision will be which city to start in. FF14's starting region, Eorzea, is divided into 3 capital cities, and each city has its own unique introductory arc to play through. And if you are curious about this game for narrative reasons, the 3 city-states are not made equal. For my money, Ul'dah is far and away the one you want to pick, both because it has the most interesting story of the 3, and because it will be incredibly relevant to the game's larger story afterward, while the other 2 will not. Luckily, both the Thaumaturge and Pugilist classes start in Ul'dah, so if you want the best possible new player experience, I strongly recommend you pick one of these 2 classes. And now you know how to have the best early game experience. You're welcome. But mind you, this is not a binding decision. One nice quality of life thing about FF14 is that you can level multiple classes on a single character. So if you want to, say, play a healer, but also want to experience Ul'dah's intro story, you can play through the intro as a Pugilist, then swap over to Conjurer, and you won't lose your story progress. But regardless of how you decide to start your adventure in FF14, you're still getting one of the most economical introductions to an MMO ever created. And I'm not even talking about that little 3-hour intro story anymore, because I could make the exact same statement about A Realm Reborn, one of the weirdest chapters of MMO history. Final Fantasy XIV's base game, A Realm Reborn, is a bit of an anomaly for a lot of reasons. If you've never heard the story of one of the most unlikely comebacks in video games, basically FF14 had an initial release that was a complete and utter disaster. So completely devastatingly bad that Square Enix literally rebuilt the entire game and you can't even play 1.0 anymore. A Realm Reborn is generally heralded as a miraculous revival for the MMO, but the part all the articles and documentaries don't mention is that the transition from 1.0's disastrous launch to the incredible game everybody stands today was a much more gradual one than just one heroic reconstruction. Here in A Realm Reborn, it's still mired to old plotlines, ancient mechanical frameworks, and decade-old MMO design logic that has not aged particularly well since. Basically, anyone who actually plays this game will tell you that it doesn't entirely put its best foot forward first, especially mechanically. All of this isn't to say that A Realm Reborn is bad. It has plenty of moments, and a lot of the most beloved plotlines in the entire game get their introduction here, but it's nobody's favorite. So, with all of that said, how the hell can I possibly get away with calling this game respectful of your time? Well, Square Enix is of course aware of this quandary, and by the way they've responded to it, it makes A Realm Reborn even weirder. See, what they did is they cut relentlessly. They obsoleted grindy, time-consuming mechanics, completely reworked how you gain abilities, and cut utterly bizarre anachronisms like how the game used to require you to level multiple classes to reach Endgame. They've even gone so far as to remove quests from the game that were pointless filler fetch quests that previously padded the game out. The Realm Reborn that you can play today is barely recognizable compared to what it was when it first came out, and the result is one of the leanest, fastest introductions to an MMO in the entire genre. The base game is well lubricated lightning, barely touching the 20-hour mark. And even inside of that, individual plotlines are even faster and wildly varied. Not enjoying the murder mystery that leads to a big spooky mansion? Not a fan of farting around with fey creatures? That's cool. Give it an hour and you'll be doing something completely different and dealing with the Spanish Inquisition instead. Every potential point of friction has been sanded away to make Final Fantasy XIV as painless to get into as possible, until pretty much the only thing you have left is the primary thing that works about A Realm Reborn, and arguably the game's entire main selling point: its story. So I want you to think for a second about what the leveling experience in an MMO typically evokes in your mind. For a lot of traditional MMOs, you go looking for quest givers in your level-appropriate area, get a little flavor text to vaguely justify whatever errand you're being sent on, then go kill 5 wolves. That's pretty much been the core loop for a good decade or two. But that's really fucking boring. And it's not remotely interesting enough to sustain you for the 40+ hours your standard MMO is going to demand you do it for. If you're lucky, eventually you'll get to the point where you can just grind the same dungeon over and over until you're high enough level to go do a different one, but even that gets pretty bland after a few hours. The truth of the matter is that the early levels of an MMO are always going to be its weakest mechanically. And FF14 is no different. Like a lot of MMOs, the early levels can be a little bit bland, but unlike those other MMOs, the sting of that is reduced significantly by the fact that the real draw is the narrative. Instead of getting caught in a haze of endless fetch quests, FF14 has the main story quest, a single narrative pillar around which your entire leveling experience from 1 to 80 is wrapped. Instead of spending your time punching things over and over and over and over and over again, you'll be spending most of your leveling experience engaging with the narrative and fighting the one dreaded specter you can't just punch away: socioeconomics. And on the rare instance that you are asked to go out and smack something, it goes something like this. Yup, that's it. That's the quest. Most MMOs are systems-oriented, with whatever story they'll fit in if they can find the space. Even other MMOs, like say The Old Republic, that have an important central narrative like FF14 does, fall into this trap where the MMO gameplay is still the thing being focused on, while the narrative, while ostensibly important, is awkwardly stuffed into whatever remaining space surrounding that gameplay they can find. FF14's leveling experience has the exact opposite priority. The narrative is the primary thing you will engage with. This is what has center stage, and combat is only ever used to punctuate that narrative when it's deemed necessary, instead of the narrative getting dragged around to frantically contextualize endless, constant combat. And during the leveling portion of an MMO, where the gameplay is weakest anyway, this is a godsend. And you might think this isn't really an important point. Some people like plot, some people like smacking things. It's all a matter of taste, so what's the big deal? But here again, think about your general expectations around an MMO. Many MMOs are structured incredibly centrally around the endgame. That's where the game's core loop is, that's where all the coolest content goes, and that's where 90% of your player base exists. Everything up to that point is a race to get there, and honestly can often feel like a bit of an afterthought. So you get a lot of MMOs where the leveling experience often feels less like a prelude, and more just faffing about, treading water in a purgatory game space, waiting for the prerequisite number of hours to be spent before you have finally grinded your way to the level cap. The big advantage of FF14's massive 100-hour narrative is that it actually gives you something satisfying and enjoyable to do during all that time. But the deeper in you go, the more that starts to change, and Final Fantasy XIV starts doing something that's kind of weird for an MMO leveling experience. It lets you fight actual, honest-to-God raid bosses. Normally in an MMO, you would only ever associate these big boys with endgame content. In these other titles, a raid boss is something almost sacred, the summit atop the holy mountain that most MMO players spend hundreds of hours grinding with the ultimate goal of eventually conquering. The raiding endgame is the signature mechanical master stroke that sets the MMO genre apart from other games, and yet you almost inevitably have to spend almost the entire game waiting to actually do a raid. But hey, FF14 just throws one at you level 20, no big deal, fam. Okay, that statement's a little bit cheeky. Obviously, the game doesn't start throwing something as complicated as an endgame boss at you, but right from the start here, you get bosses with actual raid mechanics. Ifrit gets an ad that'll wipe the party if you don't kill it, and big room-wide mechanics. Titan will knock your ass right out of the arena if you let yourself get hit, and has a mechanic where you have to break your allies out of a CC before they die. And Garuda teaches people all about line-of-sight mechanics and gives you a secondary objective by requiring you to babysit these little rock pillars so that ads don't break them. And all of that is before you even hit level 50. Unlike most other MMOs, these raid bosses, arguably the entire reason a fair number of people play these games, are baked right into the core experience. But these raid bosses, better known as trials in FF14, really start to proliferate once you hit level 50, not even halfway through the leveling experience. Once again, this is thanks to the magic of FF14's MSQ, which keeps previous patch content, aka what used to be the endgame 5 years and 2 expansions ago, briefly relevant. Again, this is really weird and different for an MMO. You're never going to start playing World of Warcraft, hit level 50, and go, gee golly, I'd really like to go run Encourage right about now. But at the end of every expansion pack in FF14, you get to go do exactly that and experience a lot of pretty neat little raid battles in rapid succession in the process while still leveling up. And the benefits of this design decision are numerous. Obviously, raid fights are fun. They're the reason a lot of us are here playing MMOs. Getting to do these fights and getting to do them so early is an amazing way to make the leveling experience more entertaining. By the time you get to the expansions, basically all you do is read plot, run dungeons, and then beat up these big boys. What's not to love about that? But when you break down that massive barrier between endgame and the leveling experience, you get all kinds of other design improvements. Your core mechanical conceit is no longer locked behind 100 hours of content, democratizing and normalizing the experience of raiding beyond just your most hardcore audience. You get a smoother difficulty curve that leads to a better educated player base that reaches the level cap with numerous lower stakes learning experiences already under their belt, and it also means that the game can whip out a fight like this and just expect the entire player base, no matter how casual, to be able to do it. By Shadowbringers, this is just the baseline expectation. There is a language to FF14's combat, a very deliberate mechanical and visual lexicon that blossoms and grows more nuanced with every expansion. And by the time you've marched through all the 100+ hours of it, you are fully fluent. And it makes for a much smoother transition to the end game. So alright, you've made it through all the expansions, your max level cap, and you've finished that story that I keep babbling about. It's endgame time, and that means glamours, baby! Unfortunately, FF14's endgame is gonna have a very familiar rhythm to it that if you've played an MMO, you're probably used to. And that is the accursed daily roulette. The basic way to progress through FF14's endgame is to pick up this currency called tomestones, which you farm by running the same 2 dungeons once a day, every day, then exchange for gear. That probably sounds a little familiar, kind of like almost every modern MMO grind ever conceived. And say it with me one more time, folks. It's really fucking boring. So let's just not do it. Let's skip all that boring bullshit and go run a raid. One of the greatest things about FF14 is that you can do exactly that and get gear just running simplified versions of the endgame raids. Or you can go do a hunt train and get all those tomestones in an hour flat. Or screw it, just go do treasure hunts for 2 or 3 hours and you'll have the money to buy yourself a set of endgame ready armor off the market. Baby, you've got options, and every single one of them are both faster and more entertaining than grinding for weeks on end. The infinite treadmill grind just doesn't exist. You just get to play the game. I know, that's a revolutionary concept for an MMO, but oh my god, it makes life so much better. And it makes FF14's endgame one of the most accessible of any I've ever seen in the genre. But okay, what does FF14 look like when you do just get to play the game? What happens when you break past the prohibitively endless grind and reach the final frontier? What does endgame raiding look like in this game?
I shall fulfill my duty as the Oracle of Darkness!
Hardcore raiding is not designed to be accessible. It is the realm of the gods, the absurd, most ridiculous challenges in the game designed to be so all-consuming that you have to base your entire life around it. Every fight is designed to be so hard it takes weeks of bashing your skull against it to beat, and perhaps most dreaded of all, you have to deal with all the foibles of getting a whole gaggle of other people to actually sit down, agree to log on at the same time, and not cuss each other out after they've spent 3 hours straight doing nothing but die repeatedly. You have to make a raid static, and if you haven't picked up on my tone, it's not a thrilling experience. But here's another one of the coolest things about Final Fantasy XIV. You can pug almost anything in this game, even the most difficult Savage content, and prevail. In most MMOs, common wisdom is that you need that steady, dedicated team to tackle the game's absolute hardest content. The margin of error is just too narrow to do it with any random person. Your buddies have to be good, and most importantly, they have to be consistent. Because if you have an ever-rotating carousel of faces, that means you're constantly relearning the first 2 minutes of the fight over and over while the new guys catch up. And it's still beneficial to make a static in FF14, but critically, you don't have to. You don't need to get a crew of 8 people to all line their schedules up. You do not have to schedule your life around this MMO and make sure you're on at X time 3 days a week. You don't have to spend all the days you're not raiding farming crap to make potions or some other inane bullshit busy work. You can play through the hardest content in the game at your own pace with completely random people at almost any time of the day or week. It is, admittedly, not as easy as popping into a matchmaking queue, but with a little bit of patience, this is the most accessible I've ever seen MMO raiding get. And this is for a lot of reasons. I already talked about one of them. Everyone's been getting taught how to raid since level 20, so there's just a better baseline understanding across the entire player base on what's required to successfully beat these overwhelming challenges. There's also a lot of great quality of life stuff, like the party finder and cross-server parties that allow the incredibly minuscule and niche player base of hardcore endgame raiders to connect easily and efficiently. A lot of the logistical challenges outside of the raid that other MMOs like to tack on have been slashed as well, and any extra equipment you might need to bring in is dirt cheap on the auction house. And unlike some MMOs that like to force players to clear an entire raid in one absurd 6-hour push, you can tackle FF14's bosses one at a time at your own individual pace. All the challenge and fun is still there, but FF14 has taken a chainsaw to every other possible arbitrary barrier and shredded them to pieces like the pointless red tape they are. But the challenges themselves are also designed a little bit differently. A lot of MMOs emphasize communication and thinking on your feet, while FF14 is more about solving the world's most complicated and unintuitive Rubik's Cube, and then memorizing an absurdly complex 90-step dance to perfection. And that latter set of prioritizations just lends itself more easily to pick up play. And I know that for 99% of people watching this video, this isn't really what's going to sell you on Final Fantasy XIV. Way back when I was talking about the first 5 hours in this game and how great the plot is, that's why you should play FF14. Even if you pick the game up, there is a very large chance you will never even be interested in exploring what I'm talking about right now. But this is where my review of FF14 gets a little more personal, because this part isn't for you. This part's for me. Because unlike a lot of people that have played MMOs for a large part of their life, I have never once been an endgame raider, despite making very serious attempts to do so. I've never even gotten to the starting line before. The grind to get there is just too long and punishing, the requirements to actually go do it too all-consuming, the people required to do it with me not present. But the idea of this more difficult content, of getting to actually bash my skull against that brick wall of absurd challenge on my own terms, of getting to just be a literal weekend raider, has always been mesmerizing. An MMO raid is an entirely singular experience in the video game landscape, and it is something I have always wanted to do and just never could. And FF14 is the game that finally let me do it. I have played MMOs consistently for 2 decades, since I was literally 10, and out of all of those games, Final Fantasy XIV was the MMO that, despite being busier than I have ever been in my life, finally let me have that experience. And I have no better or more personal way of expressing my point of just how incredibly accessible this game is, and what an absolute joy it is to participate in and be a fan of. There are all kinds of other little details I could talk about. I could talk about how easy it is to level up crafters and how they're actually fun playable classes and not just a menu to click buttons on. Or about all the little quality of life things, like the fact that classes introduced in the expansion packs don't set you all the way back to level 1 when you swap to them. Or the way FF14 handles seasonal events by making them a fun little questline you can spend 2 or 3 hours on instead of 2 or 3 weeks endlessly grinding. But 5,000 words later, I think I've made my point and then some. Final Fantasy XIV isn't just a good MMO, but it is the MMO, made just for me. And if, like me, you're an absurdly busy person that just doesn't have time for all the bullshit any other MMO will hurl your way, it is unquestionably made just for you. Hey, by the way, I've got a Patreon. If you enjoyed the video enough to get all the way here, you should go throw money at it. But thank you for watching all the way through. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Final Fantasy XIV, and I'll see you all next time.